In March 2009, 11 Taliban fighters walked 17 kilometers through hostile territory in Uruzgan province. They deliberately crossed two valleys controlled by their own forces, walked right up to an American forward operating base, and raised their hands. When intelligence officers asked why they didn't simply vanish into the local villages, the senior fighter gave a specific reason. They had learned the Australian Special Air Service Regiment was coming to their valley. Surrendering to the Americans meant interrogation and temporary detention. Contact with the Australians meant a completely different outcome. A U.S. Army Special Forces officer named Major Colton, who had executed over 200 direct action missions with Delta Force, read and dismissed this report. He assumed it was military propaganda, the kind of exaggeration units invent to secure budget resources and internal recognition. 3 weeks later, Colton received authorization to embed with the Australian task group. He wanted to see exactly why hardened insurgents would willingly choose an American prison over encountering an under-equipped Australian patrol. Colton reviewed the Australian equipment manifest and found an immediate discrepancy. The operators he observed carried heavily worn rifles and standard radios, instead of the encrypted satellite systems American teams considered mandatory. This chart shows the massive financial gap Colton discovered. American Tier 1 units issued personal equipment packages exceeding $42,000 per operator, while the Australians operated with gear valued at approximately $6,000 per man. That gap extended to the missions themselves. An average American operation cost $312,000, compared to just $41,000 for an Australian patrol. But when we adjust this visualization to track operational outcomes, the low-cost Australian node shifts to the top of the success axis. During the exact same 18-month period, in the same province, American units achieved a 53% success rate on their targets. The Australians hit 79%. A patrol would operate in total radio silence, deactivate GPS transponders, and frequently reject overhead drone support because the noise could compromise their position. Colton watched a 4-man Australian patrol execute this doctrine by spending 11 continuous days in a single observation position overlooking a suspected insurgent compound. They lay motionless in a shallow depression in the earth, urinating into bottles, eating cold rations to avoid thermal signatures, and sleeping in 30-minute increments. Standard American doctrine demanded rapid exploitation. If a target was identified, protocol dictated detaining them within 72 hours to generate measurable metrics. The Australians recommended leaving those exact same targets in place for months, using them as an uncompromised window to map entire insurgent supply networks. The two militaries fought on opposing temporal axes. One force measured success in compressed, violent minutes of overwhelming firepower, while the other relied on enduring, invisible observation. This philosophical divide fractured during a joint mission in the Kora Valley. American strike elements dictated the assault strategy, while an Australian troop provided the ground reconnaissance to confirm the target's presence. When signals intelligence showed the target moving to a new village, the American commander ordered a hasty mission adjustment. He demanded an immediate helicopter insertion to beat a closing operational window, ignoring the lack of prior ground surveillance in the new area. The Australian troop commander transmitted a response that stunned the American Tactical Operations Center. He refused to participate. Citing his national command authority, he stated that a helicopter insertion into an unsurveyed landing zone presented an unacceptable risk of compromise. The American commander overruled the warning and launched the assault. The Blackhawks landed directly into an anticipated L-shaped Taliban ambush. Within 90 seconds, operators were critically wounded. The helicopter sustained damage, and the assault force was pinned down in an open field. Decades of investment, hundreds of millions of dollars in aerial surveillance, and real-time communications infrastructure completely failed to prevent a disaster that patient ground reconnaissance would have avoided. The after-action timeline revealed that the Australian troop commander had already calculated a 73% probability of an ambush at the new landing zone. He had ordered his operators to begin moving toward the new target area before the American assault order was even finalized. 8 Australian operators marched 12 kilometers across hostile territory in 117 minutes. To preserve battery power for the firefight, they moved through the darkness without night vision enhancement, navigating entirely by terrain features they had memorized from maps. When they reached the perimeter of the ambush, they split into small teams and approached from angles the Taliban fighters had not considered. Australian snipers neutralized the insurgent positions with clinical precision, collapsing the ambush inside out and allowing a combat medic to reach the wounded Americans. Colton realized the American operators possessed vastly superior equipment, but the Australian unit possessed something more lethal: the ability to adapt to failure, anticipate the enemy, and exercise independent human judgment. The tactical victories of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment required a severe physiological toll. Military psychologists eventually documented a condition that emerged after a soldier's 8th consecutive deployment, a phenomenon they termed operational foreclosure, or the narrowing. To survive motionless in a hole for 11 days, an operator's brain must adapt. It optimizes itself entirely for the demands of close combat, permanently suppressing normal emotional and biological imperatives to handle extreme stress without hesitation. The civilian casualties of this mindset were quiet but profound. Operators treated their third divorces with the same clinical detachment as a targeting brief. Men stopped calling their children because the emotional transition ruined their psychological readiness. They developed selective anhedonia, where previous passions, like amateur photography, simply died. The psychological rewiring that allowed these men to become perfect, invisible ghosts in a combat zone actively degraded their capacity to function as humans. American Special Operations Command looked at the Australian results and drew the wrong conclusion. They assumed they could replicate the effect by increasing their own operational tempo, failing to recognize that patience is an ingrained psychological condition cultivated by an entire culture, not a dial you can turn up. Months later, Colton received the interrogation summary of a captured Taliban commander. The commander provided highly detailed intelligence on insurgent networks, but not because of American interrogation techniques. He provided the information to guarantee he remained in American custody after realizing Australian forces had been tracking him. The translation of his reasoning provided a clear lens into how the insurgency viewed the two forces. The Americans fight like lawyers, the commander explained. They have rules for everything, and if you understand the rules, you can survive. The Australians do not fight, they wait, and when they are finished waiting, there is